homemade brews and very sour brews, everything from meat to roast.
Today we're doing dinner in a pot.
On this episode of Doing the Most, we're making roast. While a lot of folks in our DTM community like to say that the roast is a lie, we have actually made roast on the channel before. We did lingua tacos back during the meat feast episode years ago, but apparently that's not enough. Apparently we need to do roast the most. So here we are bringing you how we like to make pot roast in the Doing the Most household. Let's take a look at the ingredients. Now I'm not going to read all of these ingredients off to you because it's a lot, but you can screenshot these recipe cards for your recipe box. Here's our dry brine. And here's everything that's going to go in to the roast. And then here are the ingredients for our melted onion sauce. And finally, the ingredients for our bechamel gravy. And you're also going to need some egg noodles, and we'll be cooking those in salted water al dente. So enough jibber jabber, let's get cooking. First off, get yourself a rack and something to put under it. And we're going to dry brine this meat with just a couple of ingredients, salt and sugar. This roast here is a boneless rump roast, weighing in at about 2.5 pounds. So as you can see, we're using a rump roast here. You can use basically any cut of roast because this is being braised in a slow cooker. And so all the fat that's in there is gonna melt down anyway, and cooking it low and slow is gonna make basically any roast cut tender. But for this, we like to use rump roast because it's cheap and easily accessible. Now, for the dry brine, the reason we're doing this ahead of time is a couple of things. We want the sugar and the salt to help wick moisture away from the surface of the roast, because that way it'll be nice and dry when it hits the oil in the pan when we sear it. And of course, the salt and sugar add some flavor. The sugar particularly helps add some of that caramelized flavor whenever we put the roast in the pan for that Maillard reaction. The sugar is going to burn and caramelize on the outside and create a nice crusty crust. And I promise you, a little bit of burning of that sugar that's on there is not a bad thing. It contributes to that fond kind of flavor that will dissipate out into the broth in our slow cooker. So basically what you're gonna do is take that meat out and cover it with your salt and your sugar, and make sure the entirety of the outside of your roast is covered with that dry brine. And then we're gonna put that in a cold place. I'm gonna stick it in my wine fridge, and it's gonna sit in there for a minimum of 12 hours up to 24 hours. So do this the afternoon before you need your roast to go in the slow cooker. Then we're gonna prepare our mirepoix as well as some potatoes. All of this is just flavoring aromatics that are gonna go into the roast and into the broth. And they're gonna do that by cooking with it all day long. We have a lot of aromatics here, both with the mirepoix and the potatoes, and I know this feels like a waste because we're not going to be eating any of these, but I promise you it's worth it because it's going to give us a really flavorful and rich broth that you kind of can't get any other way, especially not by just, throwing some meat and some water together. This is important. And you're gonna have a lot of leftover broth from this, so make sure you put it in some jars or bags and freeze it. Save it for a rainy day. Makes a great base for a noodle soup. I'm using a dry cast iron skillet here. That's a skillet that's been washed and then not oiled. And I'm throwing my garlic cloves in here to roast them. And essentially what we're looking to do is put some color all around the outside of the garlic. They're gonna get nice and brown, and what's gonna happen is they're gonna get mushy on the inside. Then we can add that layer of oil to our pan like we do every time we wash it. And then our cooking oil goes in the pan. All of our mirepoix ingredients go in. And we're gonna just stir those a little bit to make sure they're moving around on the bottom. And then we're gonna cover that for 5 minutes. While that's covered, we're going to get our potatoes on in there. And again, we're not eating these potatoes. They are in there to flavor and thicken up that broth, give it that nice big potatoey starchiness. And that's why we're using russet potatoes for this. Then half of our herbs are going to go in. So that's half of our thyme and half of our rosemary. This is going to give us a little bit of a duality in our herbs because we're going to add the rest of the herbs later on. Now it's time to process that garlic. We're just going to take the little stem end off of each of those cloves, and then we're going to drag it along the cutting board with our knife. Just the flat edge of the knife, and that garlic comes right apart. And if you were to continue smearing it around with your knife, you would basically turn it into roasted garlic paste. But we're not going to do that because we don't need garlic paste here. What we need is surface area. So we're just spreading it out as much as possible, and then that will end up going into our slow cooker as well. All that goes in. And now it's time to stir our mirepoix, and that's looking good. So we're ready to leave it uncovered and cook it for another 5 to 10 minutes. Let some of that liquid evaporate off and build up a little bit of color on there. Once that's done, it goes in our slow cooker. Just move that around, and what we're looking to do here is just kind of build a little pocket in the middle, and that's where our roast is eventually going to go. So you do want a little bit of your aromatics on the bottom to keep the roast from sitting directly on the bottom there. Basically, you're building a fortress of flavor to nest your roast. And now our roast goes in the pan, and we're going to start with that fat cap. So fat cap side down. And we're going to cook it like that in that nice hot, like medium high pan for about 7 or so minutes. We want to build some dark color on that and melt down that fat cap just a little bit. Then we're going to rotate that roast around from side to side, doing about 4 to 5 minutes per side just to build some browning around that roast. This creates a nice big cooked flavor on the roast. You know, sometimes folks will just put the roast directly into the slow cooker, and you miss out on building some of those big meaty characters by not putting a sear on it first. Searing all sides, and then into our fortress of flavor, and we'll just get it nestled in there as best it fits, and then build up that fortress around it, so that way we've got the aromatics all kind of holding it in place there for when we dump on our hot water. And this is water that just came off the stove, nice and hot. That'll get our crock pot heated up and get everything ready to start cooking. Lid goes on, and we're going to cook that for 8 hours on low. So important to note, we are braising this roast. This isn't one of those roasts like you see on cooking shows on TV where they stick it in the oven and roast it and you get that nice tender pink center that's kind of like a medallion cut. This isn't that. This is pot roast. This is country style pot roast. So this is going to cook in broth for a very long time, low and slow for about 8 hours. And so it is going to be brown all the way through. That's normal. Just because you don't often see that on TV doesn't mean that's not a normal way of doing roast, particularly here, pot roast. And so I promise you, it is still going to be very flavorful and very tender. That's just how pot roast goes. 7 hours into our 8-hour cook time, we need some red bell pepper and some onion chopped up. And we're gonna add that other half of our herbs. So in goes our thyme and rosemary, just all around. And again, that's gonna give us some fresh herbal flavor to complement the cooked herbal flavor that we already have in there. Add some oil to our pan, and we're adding some baking soda to our onions. And you wanna get it mixed all throughout those onions. So I know what you may be thinking. I like to cook the natural way. I don't like to use any chemicals in my cooking, but I promise you baking soda is very safe to use whether you're cooking or baking in your kitchen. Baking soda is perfectly natural, and I can't stress this enough, baking soda is perfectly food safe. So we're using the baking soda with our onions because it's going to help melt them. And it does that by raising the pH, which allows us to do a caramelized onion in 1/3 the time that it would typically take to caramelize onions. And we can do it at a medium to medium high heat instead of a super low heat. Using baking soda to break down the cell walls of onions releases a ton of compounds and enzymes, and the enzymes work on those compounds to break them down into molecules that taste sweet. One such molecule being inulin. Inulin is essentially dietary fiber, and when it breaks down during this process, it becomes a molecule that tastes incredibly sweet. It's fructose. That allows us to do melted onion sauce without any added sugar because we're using just the sugars that develop from the onion. This onion sauce is similar to a sauce from Campania called Genovese, and it's an onion sauce made with meat and onions, and it's sweet and rich and decadent, and you should try that too. But also try some melted onions. They're great on like everything. With our pan nice and greased up, the onions go in, and we're gonna melt them down. This takes about 10 minutes, and you're gonna wanna keep stirring basically the whole time because you don't want anything to burn. What we're trying to do is caramelize these onions and help them break down into a nice, delicious, and very sweet mush. And let me tell you, these melted onions are great on everything or great in everything. My recommendation, if you love ramen, like a chicken ramen, the cheap stuff, add a little bit of melted onions to it. Super nice. Once our onions are melted down after about 10 minutes, we're going to add 6 ounces of our broth to the onions and then cook that down until it becomes a sauce. And this takes another few minutes, and you'll know it's done because it'll leave a nice clean trail in your pan. So we're gonna set that aside. I'm just putting it in a mason jar here, and we'll revisit that a little bit later. Now our peppers go in, and we're just trying to build some color on those. Just, some little browning here and there. Nice cooked flavor on those. We don't want those going in raw. And then we're gonna set those aside. Next up, we gotta do our pasta. We're gonna make that al dente. So salt your water, get that boiling. And we're using egg noodles here because they are the perfect noodle for this dish. And I'm putting in enough for 2 people. This recipe makes enough food for 4 people, but there were only 2 people eating that night. Cook those al dente, you'll know just by chewing one up if it's ready to go. And you're gonna drain those and then set them aside for later. And now at the 8-hour mark, it's time for our roast to come out. You can check to make sure it's tender by inserting a fork. You'll see if it's tender and flaky just by sticking a fork in it and wiggling it around a little bit. And of course, as it goes on the cutting board, it's already falling apart for me. That's perfect, but we wanna let that rest for 30 minutes, which fortunately is just enough time to build our bechamel gravy sauce. So our butter and oil go in the pan, and then we're adding in our black pepper so we can get some of that cooked flavor on the pepper. Then our flour goes in so we can get a roux going. A blonde to light brown roux is perfect for thickening a sauce, and also it helps us get rid of some of that raw flour flavor. We're gonna need 16 ounces of our incredibly flavorful broth for this. And don't waste the rest of that broth. Make sure you store that for later. Makes a great soup on a cold day. So we'll start by putting a little bit of our broth into our roux, about 1/3 to 1/2. Stir to combine. And then our sodium citrate goes in. Again, I know, chemicals in our kitchen. This one is called sodium citrate. Sodium citrate helps us create a velvety and smooth cheese sauce by jumping in and substituting itself for some of the calcium that helps the proteins in the cheese stay tightly knit. So what happens is those proteins come apart, and then they start to act as emulsifiers, holding your cheese sauce together and creating a nice velvety kind of ropey cheese sauce, kind of like what you see in Mexican restaurants with that thick velvety queso, or fondue restaurants. A lot of them are cheating by adding sodium citrate. Sodium citrate is like a miracle, magical powder. I keep it in stock in my kitchen because we eat a ton of queso here in the Doing the Most house, and also it helps us create lovely cheese sauces like this bechamel gravy by giving us a safety blanket of cheese emulsification that helps ensure that the sauce turns out perfect every time. Then our cheese goes in, using pepper jack here. Colby would also be nice. Then our heavy cream goes in. And once all that's combined, we'll add the rest of our broth. Now this is gonna look like it's not gonna come together. It's gonna look like you're cooking milk. But after 30 minutes on a medium to medium high heat, stirring nearly constantly, you're going to build a really wonderful sauce. Make sure to check that for salt and pepper. I needed just a little touch of salt in here. And you'll see as it starts to thicken up, the bubble formation will get nice and tight. And then as long as it coats the back of a spoon like that, you know you're ready. And it's still gonna look a little thin. That's okay, because it's gonna thicken up some once it hits the meat and hits those egg noodles. Our peppers go in. And then we've got some meat to slice. And I like to use an electric knife for this because it makes nice clean cuts. This meat is so delicate that using a serrated knife and a sawing motion can actually shred it. So if you are doing that, be very careful. Make sure you cut against the grain so that way you can preserve your slices for this next step. So I'm cutting across the grain here, and then we're cutting with the grain to turn it into cubes. We are looking for 1/2 inch or smaller cubes, but not too small, and also not too big. We're gonna put a little bit of sauce on our noodles, and we're doing that just to get the noodles sauced. We don't want them, swimming in sauce. We're just wanting to coat them with that bechamel gravy. And you can see here that there's no extra sauce hanging around at the bottom. The noodles are just nice and perfectly sauced. And then separately, we're gonna sauce our meat. We're doing that because we have to be very gentle with this meat. So we're gonna put the sauce in there and very gently fold it until it's covered. Because again, we don't want our meat to shred. We want to retain cubes of meat in here so we have some of that texture in the dish. So fold that around very, very gently. And once all of your meat is sauced, you can add it to the noodles. And I know this is gonna create some extra dishes, but I promise you it's worth it. Once the meat is with the noodles, you will delicately fold just until it's combined and then plate. And again, this is a recipe for 4 servings total. So you'll see we've still got plenty of meat and plenty of sauce left over for night number 2 of this meal. After we get it plated, we put a little bit of our melted onions on top. So that way you can get a little bit of that sweet, savory onion sauce in every other bite or so. Gives a little bit of intrigue to the dish. Then we're gonna take some kale and do a chiffonade and a dice on that for a garnish. I don't really like parsley or cilantro, so kale works for me for this purpose. Not really to add flavor, just to make it look kind of nice. And there you have it, my friends. Roast, done the most. You wanna talk about a meal that's good for a cold day indoors? Eat some roast, done the most. Now let's taste it.
Everything from meat to roast.
Here we are, finally doing, I think, justice to roast on the channel.
We'll see.
She'd let me know. So it's pot roast, it's egg noodles. There is a hybrid bechamel gravy sauce. Ooh. And then there's this onion sauce that goes across the top.
My goodness.
Little chiffonade diced kale, so we can get our greens in here.
Chiffonade. Okay.
Let's eat. I've been cooking all day. Actually, I've been cooking since yesterday, technically.
I'm gonna grab this piece of roast on its own.
Oh, I'm getting a whole fork full.
Yeah, I'll do that next.
Everything for me to roast.
It has a lot of flavor. Mm-hmm. The onion really comes through. Tender.
And just the roast part.
Yeah, just the roast. I mean, it might have had some of the sauce on it, but
pretty good at making roast. Meat too. Everything kind of in
roast,
between.
I was just gonna say everything between those two categories, whatever that might be.
That's good. The bechamel's good.
I like these peppers that you put in here. Did you mention those?
I didn't, but they'll be featured in the video. Some just red bell. Let's go eat dinner.
Let's go eat dinner. It's great. Make this. It tastes good.
Cheers. Happy April Fools.